Welcome back. I'm glad to see all of you back for the next installment of this fun series on UCC history and polity. Today, the third session, we'll be looking at the UCC, the history of the UCC from 1957 to the present day. So there's a lot of stuff to cover. And one of the things I think would be good too is at the end of this class or as we go along, there are some books that I think should be in the Bering Library about the UCC. And if any of you want to buy them individually, I can recommend which books to buy if you'd like to know. And again, there's certain things that I think you'd find really helpful. So when looking at the UCC from 57 to today, there really are a few major trends, a few major things that we'll see as we tell the story. The first is wrestling with structure. You don't think of like structure, governance, polity as being the most fascinating thing in the world, but because the UCC is this hybrid denomination of different structures, debates over structure have been an ongoing part of the national setting of the church since its founding. And so one of the things that we'll be tracing as we look at this history is how that's developed, how that's evolved, and why that's significant. Another thing is something I mentioned last week is the evolving identity of the UCC. That the UCC very much was started as a denomination as the sort of forerunner, as the leading edge of the ecumenical movement, Protestant ecumenical movement. The UCC was supposed to be the shining example to other churches about all the great things that can happen through organic union of churches, that we were fulfilling Jesus's mission, and this would inspire other churches to do the same and also inspire churches to join together with the UCC. So one of the stories is how that initial identity and mission evolved over time to something very different by the time you get to the 50th anniversary of the UCC in 2007, and then up until the present day. And the third thing that we'll see going through is how the changing realities of mainline church life have affected things in the UCC from 1957 to today. Because as you know, everyone knows in the UMC or any other mainline church, the 1950s and the present day are not the same thing. there are lots of changes that have happened, and the church has had to adapt to those changes. So those three things, I think, will be the marks that you'll see as consistent themes as you go through that. How the UCC responds to the changing shape of mainline churches, the debates and discussions over structure and why those matter, and finally the evolving identity of the UCC from a church that's primarily originally about ecumenical stuff to a church that very much becomes a church about progressive Christianity, and that's its core identity. So the amazing thing is that a lot of these different elements you can see from right out of the chute in the UCC. So if you remember from last week, in 1957 was the Uniting Synod. So that was a synod where the evangelical Reformed churches and the congregational Christian churches came together for the first time in one uniting general synod. And after that, they said, okay, it's time to draft up a statement of faith, and it's time to draft up a constitution. Those things started to happen afterwards. The statement of faith, which is really cool, and I'd recommend Googling. You can Google the UCC statement of faith anytime, and we can talk about that in future weeks if we want. But it was originally drafted and then passed in 1959 unanimously. And apparently when the statement of faith was passed, people spontaneously broke into singing the doxology, a very 1950s kind of thing. And so the statement of faith comes out, and again, I would highly recommend looking at it. It gives a good encapsulation of what I would call liberal Christian theology, liberal Protestant Christian theology. And then there's the sort of workings out of the Constitution. Now, one of the things that happens, though, in 1959, at the Second Synod, one of the things that's formed is a Council for Social Action. So right out of the gates, one of the things that the UCC commits itself to is a Council for Social Action. Now, at the time, it doesn't seem that remarkable. After all, the Congregationalists and the ENR churches both had national organizations for so-called social action, what we would call social justice. And that goes back to the early 20th century and the social gospel movement. But in both denominations, and particularly the Congregationalists, the presence of the Council for Social Action caused a lot of turmoil at the time. There were those who didn't think that that should exist. What's interesting is when the UCC is formed, one of the first things that happens is they create this Council for Social Action, and there's no dispute. By this point, they're just like, of course, this is one of the things that the church does, justice stuff. And there's a bold call at the beginning for churches to engage in justice work right out of the gates. But this is one of the primary concerns that the church has. Now, by 1961, the Constitution has a draft, and that draft gets approved. And by 1963, the Constitution is fully in effect. And at the 1963 Synod, you see one of these themes that'll become a regular. It's again, General Synod meets every 2 years. It's the national, General Conference. And in 1963, the president of the denomination in 1963 gets up and delivers an impassioned speech about the racial crisis in the country and calls on the churches to step up and do their parts to fight for racial justice. This is a couple of months before the March on Washington, and the UCC, the General Synod, forms a new body entitled the Committee for Racial Justice Now. And the Synod also passes a resolution. I thought this was fascinating when I read this. So I didn't realize this until I was just reading this earlier. In 1963, General Synod passed a resolution saying that, basically saying that the General Synod, the national body of the church, would not have any official affiliation or do anything with organizations within the church that were not fully open racially. In 1963, they sort of laid down the law in 63. It's like, we are going to be a church that is not going to have any discrimination or any shadow of Jim Crow in it, period, end of story. And apparently there was a vigorous debate, but then the General Synod said, yes, we have to do that. So these commitments that come out of the block really early on, strong social justice emphasis really early on, and a commitment to be a part of that struggle from the get-go. Another part of this is they have this sort of study on urbanization. Anyone who's, if you've read stuff about the 1960s, one of the big concerns was white flight from the cities and what that did to the cities in the 1960s. And so this was very much a concern. And so the theme for these succeeding General Synods was looking at urbanization. This is where the entire General Synod is being structured around justice issues in society. This is what the emphasis is supposed to be. And in the midst of all of these things, the first debate over structure shows up. And this gets significant because this will be a constant theme throughout the UCC's history. So as I mentioned last week, you had two pre-existing corporations that were congregational bodies that got wrapped into this new national setting. And this is the source of the lawsuits over the merger that I talked about last week. So the first was the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, established in 1810 and incorporated in 1812. And the other was what became known as the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries, what was the original American Home Missionary Society, and that was the Home Missions Board of the Congregationalists. Now, these two bodies were independent corporations that were incorporated in Massachusetts, that had their own boards of directors, and had very significant endowments attached to them. And so when the denomination was formed, because these corporations had all this money and all this stuff, they didn't dissolve those corporations. Those corporations continued to exist as independent corporations, what were called instrumentalities. So imagine a national setting of the church where you have a structure, but all the money in terms of the endowments is with these two groups that are legally independent. And so this was the structure that was set up. So when all of a sudden the national setting of the church is, oh, we want you to engage in racial stuff, the question then becomes, well, can you actually mandate these independent corporations to do that? Does the General Synod have that authority? The president of the denomination actually in the original Constitution had no power His role was purely one of cheerleader for the denomination. Well, if you actually want to implement a program across the church, how are you supposed to do that when you have these independent entities with all the money that can do whatever they want? They don't actually have to listen to anybody legally. And so you have what grows out of this is this very expensive, they hired all these outside consultants, spent all this money to make a recommendation on restructuring the church, which was presented in '69. And the vast majority of which was promptly rejected. And all that money flushed down the toilet. And as history goes on, this issue with the Foreign Mission Board and the Home Mission Board, this issue with these two boards doesn't get resolved until the 1990s. Just like a little preview. But you have these struggles. One of the things that comes about from these struggles over structure is that initially the whole point was money, again, flows up through what's called OCWM, which you'll learn that acronym pretty well. Stands for Our Church's Wider Mission. OCWM money flows up from the churches to the conference to the national setting of the church. Initially, the majority of those funds were supposed to go to home missions, planting churches, supporting churches, including the church publishing house and all these different things, and for foreign missions around the world. Well, even over through the course of the 1960s, even in the course of the 1960s, you see trends where all of a sudden conferences start getting much larger. And so conferences, the statewide groups, start taking over some of those tasks in terms of supporting local churches that might have been done by the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. And they're not really clear lines about who's responsible for what. You also have the Executive Council of the General Synod, whose responsibility it is to enact General Synod resolutions, increasingly taking up more resources as well, saying, hey, we've got to respond to these resolutions rather than delegating this to the instrumentalities. So even going back to the 1960s, you have this flawed structure such that there was infighting within the national setting of the church, which is the way of institutions, but an important part of the history of the church. And the other thing is, so during the 1960s, you have the resolutions coming out of General Synod in the 1960s were so intensely justice focused that the church I currently serve, First Congregational Church of Houston, had a crisis moment in the mid-60s where they got together and they had to decide whether they were going to stay in the UCC or leave it, because so many members were disturbed by the radical, so-called radical justice focus of the General Synod whenever it got together. General Synod would get together and they'd be spouting out things against the Vietnam War, for peace, against apartheid in South Africa, they just make one statement after another. And these folks in First Congregational Church Houston were like, what are we supposed to do with all this stuff? Some of whom came from different denominations where pronouncements from the national setting were things that actually had to be acted on. So the question is, well, what do we do about all these statements? I don't agree with some of these things. Supposedly, some of the statements also had reference to the oil and gas industry. I'd be curious to go back and read some of those resolutions. And so there was a committee formed at First Congregational Church of Houston to decide what to do. And they decided to stay in the denomination, but they created a new board structure, what we call the Church and Society Board, basically to filter the stuff coming in from the UCC General Synod and figuring out what they should do with it to apply it to the local setting. And FCC Houston lost like 100 members over that to stay in the UCC. I'm very proud of the church for staying in the UCC. It's one of several times that the church has voluntarily lost members in order to stay true to its principles. Another time was in 1998 when they voted to become open and affirming, and they lost another 100 members over that. But I'm very proud to serve a church that is okay losing members to stay true to its principles. But that's very much this characteristic of the UCC and of these general synods. Now, what's interesting is when you start talking about, when you start reading about these general synods, especially in the 60s, and you can imagine what this, I'm curious what the equivalent in the Methodist Church was like in the 60s. I don't know whether it was the same or not, but in the UCC, by like 69, the 69 Synod, which was in Boston, you had this whole youth movement. All the boomers were all youth, and they were idealistic youth, and they wanted a seat at the table. So you had all these, like, apparently there was the vote on the new president of the denomination then, and there was the nominated, but then there were two minority candidates put forward from the floor, and politicking behind the scenes. One was a youth candidate and one was an African American candidate, in order to try and sort of take over the push of synod. And I mean, and you also have, coming back to the racial question. I know, David, you asked about the racial question last week. So there was a group of Black pastors in the Black ministers, clergy in the UCC that organized themselves in the mid 60s. And in the mid 60s, when the denomination is making these statements about race, this group of pastors says, okay, fine, it's all well and good to talk about ending racism. How can you commit to it? Are you actually going to hire, potentially be open to hiring someone who's African American in your congregations? This is 1965. They're calling them to do this. And say, well, how are resources allocated? Are they being allocated in a way to redress historical wrongs in terms of racism? And what does that look like? What are you doing to step up to the plate to make something happen? I mean, these concerns over race go way, way back, and really rigorous, like, hey, it's one thing to make statements and pass resolutions, but you've got to follow the money and the positions of power to see what actually happens. And so during the 1970s, what you see, at least in the national setting of the church, is a strong movement to embrace very much this sort of a different identity. So you start having for the first time quotas at the national level. I find it amusing that the first quota was to include women on the national setting boards, and the initial quota was 1 out of 3 had to be a woman. It wasn't 50%, it was 1 out of 3. That was the first quota. Nowadays, when you look at General Synod participation and involvement in the national setting of the church, there are very strict quotas about race, about age, about gender, sexual orientation, different things. Like, they want to make sure that at all the bodies of the national setting of the church, that it reflects what they want the church to aspire to be in terms of its makeup, in terms of race, ethnicity, et cetera. And that goes back to the 1970s. That started in the 1970s and has been carried on today. So if you ever have the privilege of going to General Synod, for instance, you'll see General Synod delegates, or if you go to the national setting of the church, they do their best to walk the walk when it comes to expressing diversity.
And
this
John,
really matters. Yep. Go for it.
I had the privilege or the the curse of registering delegates for our conference several times, and I'm here to tell you that if you don't get the quotas right, they will say, no, that's not going to work. You need one more under 25, or and so absolutely, John's correct. They really do walk the talk when it comes to that.
The only time I know that the Texas Annual Conference tried to have some sort of quota was a situation of some irony, in that the confessing movement and the good news movement engineered the election of Dawson Taylor as a delegate to General Conference because he was a golden youth. Little did they know that they just elected their first GLBT member to delegate to General Conference. And the elections were stopped and rearranged so that he would get elected.
Yeah. I know Dawson's fantastic, good friend of mine. So the 1970s, you see also for the first time, and if you get involved in the national setting of the church, you'll start to recognize some of these acronyms and some of these names. In the 1970s, for the first time, you have the Council for American Indian Ministries getting formed. And that gets formed in like 1971. This is right around, there's a major movements around Native American rights in the United States, and the UCC is right there. And they formed this council. There were some of the old missions of the American Board were missions to the reservations, and there still are churches that are UCC churches that are Native American churches. And so they started to they organized themselves. There is a Hispanic group within the church that organized themselves. Obviously, United Black Christians were organized very early on in the 1960s, and they continue to organize themselves. Organizations around women's rights. In 1972, there was the first LGBT group that was organized within the church. The first time that an LGBT openly gay person was ordained in the UCC was 72. William Johnson in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's one of the advantages of having a non-hierarchical structure. That's why the UCC, the Congregationalists, were the first denomination to ordain a woman, because you had a certain part of the church that said, one association was like, we want to do this. The other associations can't tell that association what to do. So the association in the Bay Area in 1972 ordained this openly gay person, being like, we're doing this. And there's nothing the other rest of the church can do about that. There aren't any top-down regulations about these things. In terms of, speaking of human sexuality, it was in 1975, when the General Synod said we have to take issues of human sexuality more seriously. So they appointed a commission. They voted to appoint a commission to study the issue and deliver a report to the General Synod, which they did 2 years later in the 1977 Synod. And so in 1977, there's this report on human sexuality that affirms the wholeness and dignity of LGBT folks, or at least LNG folks, in 1977. And the denomination, you can see this working through it from a very early time. These moments. In terms of the LGBT issue, in 1985, just to run through some of the things, in 1985, the General Synod in Ames, Iowa, which is the church, this is where I used to serve actually, in Ames, Iowa, where Iowa State University is, there was a General Synod in 1985 there, and the 1985 General Synod called on all the churches to be open and affirming for LGBT folks. The T was added a little bit later, but 1985. And that General Synod resolution also committed the national setting of the church to be O&A. So the national setting of the church, all the national offices, O&A as of 1985. And they called on all the churches to do this, but because of the nature of the polity, each individual church had to vote on that process. But the official stance of the denomination was, this is what you should be doing. And they started to provide materials and things like that to help guide churches through that process. In the late 90s, I think it was 99, is when General Synod added T to all of the LGB notifications. And then in 2005, the denomination, right after the Massachusetts marriage decision in 2005, the denomination affirmed same-sex marriage and their General Synod in Atlanta, Georgia. And what was, from everyone I know who was there, said an incredibly emotional discussion and meeting. But even after this heated discussion, right at the beginning of the gay marriage debate, in terms of legally sanctioned gay marriage, here you have the United Church of Christ General Synod saying, this is where we stand. So getting back, this whole pathway, of course, is not necessarily a smooth one, though, as you can probably imagine. When the human sexuality document was presented in 1977, even though it's passed by nearly a 2/3 majority, nearly a third of the delegates did not vote for it. And actually, out of that formed what became known as the Biblical Witness Fellowship, which were the sort of Bible thumpers within the UCC. And a few years later, in 1983, they issued the Dubuque Declaration, which was their version of the Barmen Declaration going back to the 1930s in Germany. That's the way they saw themselves, the Biblical Witness Fellowship. The Biblical Witness Fellowship was still around when I started getting involved in national stuff. They still had a small presence. They're gone now. There is no Biblical Witness Fellowship anymore in the UCC. And the churches that align themselves, with the Biblical Witness Fellowship have left the denomination long since. So that fight over sort of biblical literalism was this little flame that flamed up in the 1980s and then eventually was gone. There is a group that's in the UCC that sort of takes over that mantle. They're much more progressive, but they still take over that mantle. They call themselves, maybe Lynette can help me with this, so like evangelical or orthodox, like something traditional, like ECOT or whatever they are.
I accidentally went to their luncheon one synod, it's like, because of the name, I signed up. But
Yeah.
I also need to share, the very first synod I went to was in 2011. And of course, even though I knew that the UCC was at a national setting, open and affirming and blah, 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 there was still that part of me as a woman of a certain age and a lesbian that was a little, kind of, yeah, let's see. And so I was actually taking a polity and history class from one of the UCC seminaries. And so we had assignments, and I was assigned to one of the groups that was doing a resolution. And you will learn this, we love resolutions in the UCC. We even had a resolution about space junk, space debris, and it's fabulous. But this was some kind of human sexuality resolution. And so I would go to the workshops. I couldn't get over how concerned they were that they used the right language. Is it transgender? Is it now what's the correct thing? Now, how should the pronouns be? I was kind of overwhelmed that it mattered so much that they say it correctly and lift up and affirm and not offend anybody. I think that's when I knew absolutely that I was in the right denomination. That was a powerful moment.
Yeah, and talking about general synods, it's interesting. I've had the privilege of going to a number of them. I went in 07, 09, in 13, and then in 17 and 19. So I've been to 5, and the every single general synod, this is very UCC. Every single general synod has at least some people who are like, we're going to go protest something. So what they do in advance is, there are folks in the UCC who reach out to groups who are seeking justice within whatever city they're in, and the denomination works to work with people. When the synod was going to be in Hartford in 2007, originally it was going to be in a conference center, and a Hyatt hotel was going to be the center of it. But because of workers who were protesting some of Hyatt's policies, they ended up moving to a different facility within Hartford, Connecticut, in line with that. In 2007, the big protest was over. That was my first synod. The big protest was over anti-war stuff against the war in Iraq.
In Cleveland, of course, we protested against the Cleveland Indian name. And then in Baltimore, it was about the Washington Redskins, their name. So, we won both of those eventually.
Well, 2019 was all about Trump's immigration policies.
Yeah.
And there was a detention center in Milwaukee. We all marched down there, and it was a big thing. So there's this, especially in General Synod, there is this identity, as I said, that emerged over time, which by the time you get to 2019 in the General Synod, there's no doubt what the UCC is about. Like everyone knows what the UCC is about, and they're on board. Otherwise, they'd be in a different denomination. And that, again, that started in the 60s, and you see that carrying right through to the present day. And so looking back on the denomination, it's like, I know we were started as this ecumenical project, but what we've been is not necessarily that. Yes, we've been concerned about ecumenical relations and put a lot of effort into that and continue to. Just as a side note, in the 1990s, so in the 1980s, there was an agreement with the Disciples of Christ, Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. The UCC shares foreign missionary work with them. A place called Global Ministries. It's actually based out of Indianapolis, which is the DOC headquarters. DOC clergy can very easily apply for and work at UCC churches. A number of churches in the UCC are UCC DOC combined churches, including United Church in Austin. So the biggest UCC church in Austin is a combined Disciples of Christ and UCC church. In the 1990s, there was a full communion agreement reached with the Reformed Church in America, the old Dutch Reformed Church, the ELCA Lutherans, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and the Presbyterian Church USA. So as an ordained clergy person, I could serve and apply to churches in any of those denominations. I'd have to go through a process to get my standing recognized, but the process is laid out. It's fairly straightforward. And the churches have these mutual community agreements. So
there seems to be one mainline church, at least, that seems to be missing from that group. I just, and it may be the Episcopalians as well, or the Baptists, but I noticed the Methodists are not.
what's funny is that the Episcopalians have a shared communion agreement with the EOCA Lutherans, and we are sort of have a full community with the Lutherans, but not with the Episcopalians. And it's a very Episcopalian reason as to why that's the case.
See, we have an arrangement, both the Episcopalians and the Lutherans, but it wasn't enough. So, for example, if we decided to go to the Episcopalians and return to Canterbury, what Diane would have to go through was bizarre.
Yeah, I can see that. So the Episcopalians apparently recognize the Lutherans because in Sweden, the bishops that had been Catholic bishops, when it became Lutheran, they kept the same bishops. And so the Episcopalians were like, they've got the apostolic succession, great. Which is
we lost that one.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, so there are these different ecumenical relationships that exist. Now, getting back to some of the story of the development of things, one of because the story on structure is important to talk a little bit more about. So by the 1980s, what had happened? Now, the denomination was headquartered in New York City, in the God Box in New York City. So the God Box is sort of the phrase for the office building that's next to Riverside Church on Riverside Drive in New York City. It was a building that was sponsored and built by John D. Rockefeller Jr., the same guy who bankrolled Riverside Church. And it was supposed to be, that's where the National Council of Churches is located. It's supposed to be the place where the denominational headquarters of all these mainline churches were. And they were at one point in the middle of the 20th centuries. And the idea was so that the denominational executives of all these different churches could work together and hopefully move towards union. So the UCC was based in New York City. And what you had in the 1980s was a really nasty situation in the national church from all descriptions I've heard, because you had this continuing decline of OCWM funds. And so the OCWM funds were being crunched from several directions. One was you had churches that were shrinking. So, and when a church is shrinking and in budgetary difficulties, and you have to make hard choices about where you're going to spend your money, you're not going to cut from taking care of your building if you can avoid it. You're not going to cut salaries of your clergy or other staff if you can avoid it. And so if you're really pressed to cut something, you're going to cut your denominational support. And so as there was pressure on churches in the 70s and into the 80s, denominational support started to slide. And then, of course, you have the conferences whose bureaucracies are growing like hand over fist. These bureaucracies that are growing hand over fist. And so these conferences are soaking up a larger and larger percentage of the OCW money that they're supposed to be handing on to the national church. Meanwhile, General Synod, because General Synod gets together and is like, woohoo, we're going to go do these great things. General Synod starts creating all these national bodies to deal with various justice-related issues. So there are these, bodies that were created by General Synod, the national office, but they don't have any funding. So by the time you get to the 1980s, you have this situation where the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries has got a ton of money. The Foreign Missions Group has got, World Ministries has got plenty of money. And then all these other people, all these other organizations are, out on Broadway Avenue just begging for a dime. In fact, in the 1980s, it was so nasty, you could believe this. In the 1980s, if you worked for the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries, like the salaries there were like 50% higher than the salaries in the rest of the church. They worked in the same office building, but everyone knew that the people in the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries were getting paid substantially more than everybody else. But they didn't share their numbers even with different groups. I mean, it was like all the descriptions I've heard, it was just toxic. The president of the denomination made significantly less money than the head of the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. You can see how this just created a lot of animosity and just backbiting among the different groups. Another issue was at the time, I think it started in the 1970s, but certainly by the 1980s, the boards of directors for these different organizations started to get just bigger and bigger and bigger because everyone wanted a seat at the table. So all of these interest groups, whether it be the Council for American Indian Ministries or the United Black Christians or the LGBT Caucus or different groups, all wanted representation on the boards of directors of these different national entities, particularly the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. And so over time, these boards grew to be like 150 people on a board of directors. which what that actually means is the board of directors doesn't do anything other than just rubber stamp the agenda that they get given. Also, every meeting of the boards of directors, people get an all expense paid trip to New York for that meeting. So think of all the resources that were being drained during that time, just paying for people to show up at these meetings in order to make sure everyone's got represented. It was just, there was a lot of toxicity in the 1980s in the church. And so there was this sense of, hey, we have to change this. And so the first step was they moved from New York City to Cleveland, the headquarters, because Cleveland's just so much less expensive to live there. There still are a couple of things that are still in New York. The pension board is still in New York, for instance, but everything else, and the United Church Funds, which is the organization that invests in endowments and things like that, those are both still in the God box in New York. Everything else has moved to Cleveland. So that was one. And again, the Ohio Conference is one of the conferences that it's the largest conference, and it has a lot of old ENR and congregational churches both in the Ohio Conference. So they moved the offices to Cleveland, and then they reorganized all the national settings to create a more collegial atmosphere and an atmosphere where people could work together. So that restructuring took through the 1990s and was just, soaked up a lot of time and effort. It didn't end there, however, because the issues weren't fundamentally solved. The national setting was still taking up too much money just in terms of meetings. And so through the course of the late 2000s, and I was actually on the Office of General Ministries board when these discussions were going on, so I had a front row seat on these discussions. What happened was and the reason why I had that is because I was under 30 at the time, and they needed someone under 30 going back to the quotas. So I fit one of the quotas, so I got to sit on one of these national boards, which was fun, I have to say. But all of a sudden, what they did was they moved from the old setting to now there's what's called the United Church Board. Now there's just one board for all the entities. And because those corporations still exist, if you're on the United Church Board, you're technically on the board of directors of the old American Board, and you're on the board of directors of the old American Home Missionary Society, and you're on the board of directors of all the organizations, all the old corporations, are all combined into one. So they all have the same board that meets together. And occasionally for legal purposes, they have to put on a different hat for different votes, but that's all one board. And to get down to that board took a lot of discussions. I'll just say that I'm trying to be charitable. There were some people who had been sitting on those national boards and having 4 trips a year to Cleveland for many years, who all of a sudden weren't going to be able to do that anymore. And these were people who were historically underrepresented groups. So there were various justice concerns involved in it, and those concerns were voiced very loudly in language that wasn't always the most Christian. But to the church's credit, they actually did go through and do that. And so now the national structure is, it's just a fraction of itself of what it was before. It's much more efficient, because it has to be. The funds just aren't there like they used to be. So the national setting of the church, it's when they actually built the office in Cleveland when they moved there in '89. And I think someone was telling me of the original 7 floors of offices that are there, I think they now only occupy 2 or 3 of the floors. The others are they're trying to rent out to someone else because the national setting of the church has shrunk so much. So there's been the national setting of the church has seen a lot of changes that have happened through that period. A couple of other things are worth mentioning about the denominational history. One is some of the publications that have come out from the church. So the UCC has the oldest publishing house in the country with Pilgrim Press that goes back to the 17th century. So Pilgrim Press, it was the old press of the Congregational Church. That's still around, and they still publish books. They have a lot of great collections, particularly on things, unsurprisingly, like LGBT stuff in Christianity. They have some really good titles on there. So if you're interested, you can go check out some of their books. It's things like one of their titles, I think, was like "Coming Out Gay." This is a book that was written like 10 years ago. It's like, how do you help your teenager, come out in a faithful way? That kind of thing. And then there's also the United Church Press, which publishes more of the denominational books. So some of the books that I might recommend that Bering has in our library, or if any of you are interested, they get published by the United Church Press. So those presses are still around. So they published in 1974 a hymnal, which was not well received. And not many people used. When I was growing up in a congregational church in Massachusetts in the 80s and into the 90s, we still used the old Pilgrim hymnal, which was published in the 50s. It was the old congregational hymnal we still sang from. There wasn't a denominational hymnal that we used through the 1980s. That was 30 years after the merger. Still no hymnal that actually is a combined hymnal. And then in the hymnal question, this is because actually First Congregational Houston gets involved in the hymnal question. So the hymnal question, they eventually decide to have a new hymnal. And this is after, of course, the Methodists have their hymnal in the mid-80s. A lot of the other people have hymnals coming out at the same time. And so the UCC is sort of late to the hymnal game. And the then music director at First Congregational, Maggie Tucker, is on this committee to help explore and write the New Century hymnal. And according to Maggie, again, this is run by the Board of Homeland Ministries. So they have a fair amount of money. And Maggie's like, they flew us on the committee all over the country to go visit these different churches and visit these different places. She was like, and Maggie was like, this is like a total waste of money. The church spent millions of dollars producing the New Century hymnal. And the New Century hymnal, if you've ever seen it, is, back in the 1970s, General Synod passed a resolution requiring all documents coming out of the national setting of the church to have gender inclusive language. And so there was a committee for the New Century hymnal that was rewriting all the hymns, not just for gender inclusive language, but also for concerns over theology. And Maggie Tucker at First Congregational actually said, I think we're going in the wrong direction here. You're going to put out a hymnal that people won't like. And First Congregational Church of Houston tried to, through the process, put forward a resolution to the National Synod in 1993 to try and change the direction where the New Century hymnal was going. And one of the old church members at UCC, who unfortunately died during the pandemic, Dave Nussman, showed me a letter from the then head of the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries, basically telling off First Congregational Church of Houston for butting in on the hymnal. And so the hymnal came out, and just as people at FCC Houston predicted, the hymnal was a total bomb. Like, nobody liked the hymnal because it came out for Advent 1995, and you open it up and all the Christmas hymn words are changed. So you're singing, "O come all ye faithful," and it's like, "O come all you faithful." So they took out the ye, and as opposed to like, "O come let us adore him," "O come let us adore him," they changed it to "Let us come in adoration." Now again, they didn't need to change that. I mean, like, Jesus is actually masculine. Like, you can say, "Oh, come, let us adore him," and that's not being not gender inclusive. But they wanted to take that out. So they're changing all these different hymns, and people were. I mean, you can imagine people showing up, for Advent and being like, "Woohoo, new hymnal! This is great." And being like, "What is going on here?" And out of that, First Congregational Houston decided to write their own hymnal. And so First Congregational Houston wrote this hymnal in the mid 1990s called "Hymns of Truth and Light," which is now used by like 125 churches in the denomination, including the church I grew up in Wellesley, Massachusetts, which is much bigger than First Congregational Houston, uses that hymnal, which is kind of cool. I'm like, yeah, go First Congregational Houston. But so one of the interesting discussions is around that hymnal. So you go to UCC churches and you'll see all sorts of different hymnals in the pews of UCC churches. Some UCC churches I know have the Faith We Sing, the Methodist supplement, which is excellent, and they're like, "Oh, this is great. We're putting that in there." Some use the Disciples of Christ. One of the churches I did an internship at used the Disciples of Christ hymnal. Another church I was doing an internship with in 2004 still had the Pilgrim hymnal next to the New Century hymnal in the pews. The Pilgrim hymnal from the 1950s. 50 years later, it's still the Pilgrim hymnal in the pews. It's yeah. So there's no mandating of this.
Well, I bought a copy in a fit of enthusiasm, along with the new translation of the Heidelberg Catechism, the UCC hymnal. I will only say that they offer 4 verses for 4,000 tongues to sing, whereas we have approximately 32 from which we can choose.
Yeah, well, I know, like, so it's number 1 in the Methodist hymnal, right?
I would also ask you, why are you singing Christmas hymns during Advent? But that's another issue.
Advent hymns, right? You're right. You're 100% right. Yes. So the hymnal, and again, the New Century hymnal's got a lot of great things in it. I like a lot of the tunes in there. I've worked in churches that have used it, and I really do like parts of it. there were other parts of it that weren't so great, and they could have done a much better job. And there were people who told them, hey, you're going down a wrong path. And those who were on the committee just did not care. So now in 1986, another publishing thing, they published the Book of Worship, which is our sort of guide for liturgy. It comes in two forms. It comes in this form, then it comes in a loose leaf binder, which when I was in divinity school and we were talking about this, the other denominations laughed. They said, well, of course the UCCs would be a loose leaf binder for your liturgical guide, your Book of Worship. So, you know, there's actually a lot of, I mean, the cool thing is, like most other liturgies that came out at the time, whether it be the Book of Common Prayer, Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, and some of the Lutheran liturgies, I assume the Methodists did a similar thing. There was this post-Vatican II great concern for church history and church liturgies that shows up. So the liturgies here really do draw on a lot of Christian, you know, historical liturgical things. So if someone, you know, if you guys are, it sounds like, you know, Barings a church that appreciates liturgy, definitely the new century hymnal, I'm not wild about, but the Book of Worship is worth looking through to see what they do. I mean, I officiate a ton of weddings, unsurprisingly. And one of the things that I like to do, because this is my UCC heritage, I like to make sure that people are comfortable with all the words that they're saying, because I don't have any, like, I'm not trying to impose my beliefs or the beliefs of my denomination onto any couple that I'm marrying. I'm like, this is your service, and I'm here to help facilitate that and invite God into the ceremony. So I give all these couples copies of different liturgies. And it's amazing how many times they really, really like the words of the UCC liturgy, which surprises me because the UCC is not known as a liturgical church. And yet the Book of Worship has a lot of very good things in it. And it's worthwhile checking. Like unlike the New Century Hymnal, they do gender inclusive language so artfully in the Book of Worship, you don't even notice it. Nowhere is God, the only place God is referred to as Father in the book is in the baptismal liturgy. Because in order to make a baptism valid for different denominations, you have to be baptizing the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. You know, I mean, maybe there's one other place where they use Father. I mean, Father just does not appear here. But they do it in a way that doesn't make it feel clunky. So I've always been very impressed by that. I mean, they do say Our Father as one of the options for the Lord's Prayer, because it's the Lord's Prayer. But the rest of it is, again, it's worthwhile looking through, especially for a church that cares about liturgy. I thought they did a surprisingly very good job with that. So there are these different things that the denomination has come out with, publishing-wise. I'm trying to think if there's any other things that are worth mentioning.
The Book of Worship, your Book of Worship has a number of very interesting services that we didn't have in the Methodist Book of Worship. It's a rather nice. I had to go to some extent to find the binder to put the loose leaf pages in, which I was surprised at receiving.
Yes, no, I mean, there's some really interesting things there. So I would say, just in my experience of the denomination, within my own history, again, I was raised in the UCC. I personally have seen a big shift in the UCC in terms of its identity and its sense of self. When I was raised in a UCC church, congregational church in Massachusetts, the congregational identity was very much at the fore, and that was very much a part of it. Over time, in my time in the UCC, the denomination really has taken on a different identity. It became, and I do mark it to the 2007 General Synod, the 50th Anniversary Synod, which is in Hartford, Connecticut. That's where Barack Obama spoke. He was a longtime member at Trinity UCC in Chicago. They had some amazing, and there was this whole sense of the denomination there of, we know who we are now. After the 2005 marriage decision in Atlanta, some of the churches left the denomination, and the denomination had this great moment of like, that's fine. We know who we are. And if you want to be a part of us, come. Part of it was also the God is Still Speaking campaign, which came out around the same time, which if you're not familiar with it, there's some cool, if you Google, God is Still Speaking campaign, UCC ads, you can see the ads that were made for that campaign. And these ads were on TV at the time in different parts of the country. And this is a really compelling redefinition of the church. And it was really successful. And that inspires me to see where the church has gone. That's why when I was, I think this is the last thing I'll say, and see if there's any questions, but when I worked at the church in Iowa, in Ames, Iowa. The name of the church was United Church of Christ Congregational. It had been First Congregational Church for a long time. And then in the 80s, they changed it to United Church of Christ Congregational. And when we put out, we put out new signs around the church when I was there, because I wanted to update a lot of things around the church. So we put out new signs. And on the new sign, it just says Ames United Church of Christ. And our website is amesucc.org. And there was no congregational anymore in any of the names. And, one of these old church members, Paul Morgan, great guy, came into my office. He was extraordinarily unhappy, and he had been raised a Congregationalist. And he proceeded to berate me for, sort of picking congregational out of the name and all these other things. And, there was this irony of Paul talking to me there, is that one, like the book that was closest to him on my desk was Wilson Walker's Creeds and Platforms of Congregationalism. Which if you really want to dork out on congregational history, that's your book. And that book I just happened to be reading. I was literally right next to him. And I didn't know how to say to Paul, I'm like, Paul, I know a lot of UCC clergy. I don't know any that are more rooted in congregationalism than I am. It's like, we're changing the name of things because that's who we are. We are the United Church of Christ. And, particularly in Iowa, I'm like, this makes total sense. So yeah, I don't know whether or not FCC Houston's ready to change their name, but yeah, so it's an interesting denomination and a cool history. And the book that here's one of the books that you guys, there's this, so there's something called the Living Theological Heritage. The UCC's wrestled with sort of in the 1980s, they had one of the crises, that the internal crises the church had was, oh no, we're not being theologically rigorous enough. Which I don't know how much that's true or not. I don't know. So they decided they came up with a theological magazine called Prism. And a few years ago, I literally called the denominational office and I said, send me every back issue you have in Prism. I want to try and get a complete collection. So I have most of the issues in Prism, but only ones they had left in stock then. I cleared them out. But they created out of that this sort of intentional theological stuff, what they call the Living Theological Heritage of the UCC. And so it's just 7 volumes, these little green volumes that are wonderful. And they are all these source documents. And it goes back to the first volume is like the early church. They really do go through everything. But volume 6 is all in the merger conversation. Volume 7 is from the merger to roughly 2000. And it's got some just phenomenal documents in here where you can see the pronouncements people have made, excerpts from speeches, resolutions passed at General Synod, across a whole range of issues that allow you to just say, okay, this is really is the story of the church in sort of documentary form. So one of the things I think would be really fun to have on your shelf at Bering is the Living Theological Heritage, particularly volumes. Volumes 5, 6, and 7 are the 3 most important because they deal with the 19th century history of the Congregationalists, the ENR churches, the Christian churches, and then the merger discussion, and then since the merger, this volume. So I'd just say that. Now, are there any questions that anyone has? With our last couple minutes, any questions about the last 50 years and 60 years in the UCC? Yeah.
Well,
David?
this is probably something you're going to be talking about next week because it's probably more related to polity. But I noticed that sometimes you talk about church conferences as opposed to, are those like statewide organizations? Associations, I think, are what we kind of consider annual conferences, or that's sort of an analog, I guess. So what do you mean by conference? Or are these actual organization meetings as opposed to like groups?
No, it's a geographical designation. Well, and yeah, we'll talk more about that next week. They're mostly state-based, but not entirely. So and I'll go through all that next week about
I just
how that developed. Yeah. No, great question. Yeah, the terminology is a little different, so it takes some getting used to.
Yeah.
Anything else about the history? Hopefully you're like, oh, look at this. I don't know how it compares to the Methodist history of the last 60 years. I'm not familiar with the Methodist history, but certainly there's that. This is why I'm so inspired by the founding of First Congregational. I think I mentioned that Grady Harden, the founder of Chapelwood, helped found First Congregational Church. in Houston. And he did it because here's Grady Hardin, a pretty progressive guy, just wanting to have a more progressive voice, Christian voice in town. And he's like, even as a progressive Methodist minister, he's like, I can only say so many things. I can't get up and say what I want. My bishop will come down on me in a nanosecond.
A. Frank Smith.
What's that?
Well, that was A. Frank Smith. But suffice it to say that the Methodist Church was officially segregated until 1968, and unofficially till not so long ago.
Yeah. And again, there still are, I mean, the UCC is still predominantly, it's like, still predominantly white church and wrestles with a lot of different stuff, but there are aspirations. In 1993, one of the great resolutions of the General Synod, so there are different marks of the church that they pass in the national setting that have become important. So one was the Just Peace resolution. So making the church committed to sort of a just peace. If there is no justice, you can't have peace, kind of thing. So 1985, they passed that. The Open and Affirming was 1985. They passed a resolution being in a multicultural and multiracial church, trying on the churches to be more multicultural, multiracial. There was a resolution that was to be accessible for all. So regardless of different levels of ability, that the churches should be accessible for all. And then the fifth one is the original one. It's a united and uniting church. So sometimes you'll see that about those 5 marks of the church that emerge.
One of the other things you were talking about, the GLBT history, it's like, I don't know if you're aware, but 1972 General Conference was where we got the language about the incompatibility.
Oh,
so
okay.
So that's, we're on 49 years now, which some of us kind of look at that as, well, this is a perfect time because it's a Jubilee year,
Yeah, for sure.
So
and the wording of that, the incompatibility clause, was basically the product of well, actually it was proposed in Houston, but it came from what was considered in the 60s, of course, when I was growing up in high school, was the second Jesus or Moses, and maybe both, of Methodism, was Albert Outler, the creator of the quadrilateral and other such things, the great Methodist theologian. But that was his language.
Where did he teach? What was the seminary he worked at?
Perkins, Yale.
Yep.
He was at Yale for a while, and then Perkins for a long time. He was a great Wesley scholar and ecumenicist.
Great. Any other, sort of at the end of our time, any other final questions? Again, we've got 2 more rousing weeks to learn about the UCC. Woohoo! All that fun stuff. The Polity stuff will be interesting next week too, because part of it is really to see how you get to fit into the mix, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
And the another cool thing is that this summer is General Synod, and it'll be virtual because of the pandemic, because they weren't sure what was going to happen. So everything's virtual. So if you want to sign up for it, you can sign up for it and participate virtually in it. I'm kind of curious what they're going to do with it, but I'm looking forward to it. So it'll be easy to attend.
Nothing more fun than Polity.
Well, it's
I'm serious about that. I love it.
The devil's in the details. Yeah, you really have to know it. It's important.
Oh yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all very much. I gotta actually just jump on another meeting right now, but I look forward to seeing you next week. And again, if you have any questions that you want to think about between now and next week, write them down, and I'll be happy to do my best to answer them, and or direct you to some sources that might have the answer as well. So take care.